The end of World War II brought about major changes in the world order. In particular, Japan, which had military control over a vast territory in the Asian region, was defeated. As a result of Japan's withdrawal, the so-called colonial powers that had ruled the area, such as Britain, France, and the Netherlands, returned. However, these colonial powers were also exhausted by the Second World War. As a result, they were never able to regain full control as they had before. National independence movements to decide for themselves about their own countries gained momentum, particularly in Asian countries. Decolonization movements were gaining momentum around the world. The first place to attract attention in Asia was Manchuria, which was under Japanese rule. Towards the end of World War II, the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria in an attempt to establish security in the Far East. The Soviets defeated the Japanese army and occupied the area. By taking control of Manchuria, the Soviet Union sought to strengthen its defenses and expand its influence in the Far East. China played a major role in this. China was in the midst of a fierce civil war between the nationalist government led by Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese Communist Party led by Mao Zedong. When Japan attacked, both sides used this as an excuse to resist the Japanese invasion. As a result, the two sides temporarily postponed their conflict and cooperated to oppose Japanese rule. However, with Japan's defeat, that justification was lost and the two sides once again found themselves in conflict. Thus, in post-war China, the Kuomintang and the Communist Party were engaged in a fierce struggle for leadership. At this time, it was the nationalist government that was internationally recognized. The nationalist government was forced to respond to the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. However, before entering the war, the Soviet Union had been promised by the United States and Britain that it would gain interests in Manchuria. This was a promise made without Chiang Kai-shek presence. This was not something that the nationalist government could easily accept. However, Chiang Kai-shek believed that any alliance between the Soviet military and the Chinese Communist Party must be avoided at all costs. Therefore, Chiang Kai-shek decided that certain information was necessary to gain the Soviet Union's recognition of the nationalist government. Chiang Kai-shek agreed to recognize the Soviet Union's interests in Manchuria in exchange for the recognition of the nationalist government as the legitimate government of China. Thus, the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship and Alliance was signed between China and the Soviet Union. As a result, the Soviet Union placed great importance on its relationship with the nationalist government. The Soviet Union began to pressure the Chinese Communist Party to cooperate with the Kuomintang. In this way, the Soviet Union became deeply involved in the situation in Asia. The United States also became more actively involved in Asia. They were wary of Japan, which had become a powerful force in East Asia. We will ensure that they never again pose a threat to America or the world. The United States believed it could weaken China through thorough demilitarization and democratization. They had high hopes for Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government to replace Japan as the leader of Asia. America wanted to play the role of Asia's policeman. Therefore, they were considering recognizing the nationalist government as an ally and strengthening it. The United States and the Soviet Union support the nationalist government and weaken Japan. In that respect, our interests were aligned. With the intentions of such major powers as a backdrop, the Republic of China has become a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. This has greatly enhanced its international standing. People in China began to look forward to a return to peaceful days and to socio-economic prosperity. For Taiwan, which had long been under Japanese rule, the end of the war also meant liberation from colonial rule. After the Japanese army left, the nationalist government's troops came to Taiwan. They are greeted with cheers of joy from the crowd. Thus, the nationalist government began to rule Taiwan. Chen Yi, who had previously served as the administrative chief of Fujian province in Taiwan, was appointed the first chief executive of Taiwan province. However, the rule of the nationalist government that began from this point onwards was a huge disappointment to the Taiwanese people. Most of the officials were from the mainland, and Taiwanese people were excluded from politics. Food shortages also became more serious, and dissatisfaction with the nationalist government rapidly grew. Indonesia and Vietnam in Southeast Asia were among the first countries in the world to move towards independence. In both regions, the power vacuum created by Japan's withdrawal was seen as an opportunity. Sukarno declared independence in Indonesia and Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. However, the former colonial powers of Holland and France did not recognize this independence. After recovering from World War II, both countries sent troops to try to regain their colonies. This led to the Indonesian and Vietnamese Wars of Independence. Initially, the Dutch and French believed they could crush the native rebellions with a single blow. In reality, the international situation has changed dramatically, and we are realizing that things are not going well. The people of Indonesia and Vietnam, which had declared their independence and were now established, had already begun to have a sense of national identity. The Indonesian and Vietnamese people continued to put up strong resistance. The Dutch recolonization of Indonesia provoked strong international backlash, and the United Nations also intervened. The Netherlands believes that Indonesia is not an independent sovereign state. We maintain that this was a domestic matter and that our actions were merely police actions. The United States insisted that hostilities must be stopped at all costs. A ceasefire resolution is adopted by the Security Council. This resulted in the Dutch halting military operations. Dutch troops withdrew under UN supervision. Indonesia achieved independence. The United States has taken a somewhat ambiguous approach in Vietnam. He was not in favor of the French idea of recolonization. They had no intention of supporting Ho Chi Minh and the communist forces to the point of coming into conflict with France. As a result, unlike Indonesia, Vietnam was unable to receive sufficient support from the international community. Nevertheless, Vietnam bravely resisted France's short-term strategy and succeeded in prolonging the conflict. France, troubled by this, brought in Bao Dai, the last emperor of the Vietnamese dynasty, and established the state of Vietnam. He transformed the First Indochina War into a battle between communists and nationalists, rather than between colonial rulers and independence forces. And they tried to gain the understanding of the international community. Japan's defeat in the war was also a liberation for Chosun, which had been ruled by Japan for a long time. However, this liberation was not won by the Chosun People's Independence Movement, but was achieved suddenly through Japan's defeat. This raises the question of who will lead the post-liberation situation and how. The first to make a move was left-wing nationalist Yo Eun-hyun. He called for Chosun to become independent and united various political forces to establish the National Foundation Preparatory Committee. The founding of the People's Republic of Korea. However, the United States and the Soviet Union did not recognize the new state that was established in Chosun. Liberation in Chosun was largely brought about by the United States and the Soviet Union, and the voices of independence activists were ignored. Around the time when the Soviet Army landed in northern Chosun and advanced, the American military was still in Okinawa and was not in a position to immediately send troops. As a result, the United States worried that if things continued as they were, the Soviet Union would take control of the entire Chosun Peninsula. He proposed to the Soviet Union that the Soviet Army occupy the area north of the 38th parallel north, and the American Army occupy the area south of it. The Soviet Union accepted the proposal, and Chosun came to be divided and ruled by the military forces of both countries.